So let's have a look at the main arteries and veins that supply the neck region and what's in front of them, what's behind them, and everything to do with that. Okay, so we've already looked at how the aorta splits off into the brachiocephalic trunk sort of artery branch and the left common carotid artery or branch and the left subclavian branch. Then the brachiocephalic branch itself divides into the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery. You can see that happening here. So above the manubrium and the sternum, you can see the brachiocephalic trunk. We already said that it divides into the right common carotid artery as well as the right subclavian artery. Okay, so here you can see the subclavian artery and the common carotid artery. The subclavian artery divides into the thyrocervical trunk as well as the costocervical trunk. The thyrocervical trunk, then it has its own divisions. I've got a mnemonic for the thyrocervical trunk, which is called SAT, SIT, SAT-KIT. So SA stands for suprascapular artery, TC stands for transverse cervical artery, IT stands for inferior thyroid artery. So, as you can see, one of the first branches of the thyrocervical trunk is the suprascapular artery, which goes down this way towards the shoulder, as you can see. Then that's SA, then you've got TC. This is the transverse cervical artery, which goes up this way, and it goes across our muscles. And then here, going back into this way, is the inferior thyroid artery, and this actually innervates the thyroid gland. Now, where are all these blood vessels located in relation to our major muscles? So these are all under the sternocleidomastoid muscle. When you remove the sternocleidomastoid muscle, then you see all of these blood vessels and nerves. So underneath, then you can see here, and then beneath these is going to be our scalene anterior muscle. So our scalene anterior muscle sandwiches all of these blood vessels and nerves, veins, and then on top, so it's the scalene anterior, then here's everything on top, and then on top of that will be our sternocleidomastoid muscle. Okay, so moving on from that, also something in relation to the brachial plexus. Here is the brachial plexus, and the brachial plexus actually comes out between the scalene anterior muscle and the scalene medius muscle, middle scalene muscle as well. So that's where the brachial plexus comes through. Now, a couple of other things to note is that here, the kind of main vein and artery you're going to see is the internal jugular vein and the common carotid artery. Internal jugular vein and the common carotid artery. If you remember the carotid sheath, carotid triangle, carotid sheath mnemonic, it was IC 10 cc's in the IV. And IC stood for internal carotid artery. 10 was a vagus nerve, and this is vagus nerve traveling right between the internal jugular vein and the common carotid artery. So, again, internal carotid artery. Yeah, we already have that somewhere. And then you have 10 for vagus nerve. Then you have CC for common carotid. Then you have IV for internal jugular vein. This was all forming the carotid triangle. Look at the carotid triangle notes to review this. And that's pretty much it. Basically the subclavian vein and the internal jugular vein join to make the brachiocephalic vein, I believe.